Hello, I'm Tanya Chamberlain from the Division of Anatomy here at the University of Leeds, and in this video we're going to be having a closer look at toothache. We're going to be having a look at the neuroanatomy of toothache and how pain from the body can be transferred to pain to the brain. After this video, and after any further necessary study, you should be able to describe the general features of the pathways conveying pain, temperature, and information to the conscious awareness. Explain what is meant by the term somatotropy. Indicate the function and trace the route of the spinothalamic pathway. Outline the innervation of the teeth. Define the terms ganglion and cranial nerve nucleus. Describe the trigeminal ganglion and the trigeminal nuclei. Locate the spinal tract and the spinal nucleus of the trigeminal nerve, and locate the trigeminothalamic pathway. Describe the pathway by which pain and temperature information are conveyed from the head to the cerebral cortex. So let's go and have a look first at the spinothalamic pathway. So we have various different pathways which are able to transport information from the periphery to the central nervous system. We are able to convey a more complicated information by a pathway called the dorsum column pathway. This includes the ability to interpret discriminative touch, pressure, and complex stimuli such as vibration, and something called proprioception, which is the sense that allows us to know where our body parts are without having to look at them. This pathway is very fast and allows us to make snap decisions. We also have a pathway that conveys more simple information, from pain, crude touch, and temperature. This is the spinothalamic pathway. This pathway is much slower, and it makes more sense that this can be slower because the stimulus is very obvious and doesn't require a great deal of processing. Does it hurt? Is it hot? Okay, maybe I should stop touching it then. This latter pathway is the one we are going to look at today. In order for us to move forward with the spinothalamic pathway, we need to recap the role of neurons within the central nervous system. The neurons have a body and a long axon. The body of the neuron is found within the grey matter of the CNS. So that's the cerebral cortex and the subcortical grey matter of the brain. The body of the neurons are also found in the grey matter core of the spinal cord. In the peripheral nervous system, those cell bodies of the neurons are found in ganglia. White matter is made up of axons. The white matter tracts of the cerebrum are displayed on the left image, whilst the white matter tracts of the spinal cord are the columns of the periphery of the spinal cord. In the rest of the body, the peripheral nervous system, those axons are visible as nerves. So to summarise, the grey matter, the ganglia contain cell bodies, and the white matter or the nerves contain neuron axons. In the first video we had a look at spinal nerves and we determined that there were 31 pairs of segmental spinal nerves, numbered according to the order in which they leave the spinal cord, from most superiorly to most inferiorly, the coccygeal nerve. These spinal segments belong to the peripheral nervous system, and they conduct messages to and from the central nervous system. Within the grey matter of the spinal cord, these peripheral nervous system segmental spinal nerves synapse with ascending or descending fibres to or from the brain respectively. We are not interested in the descending fibres today. These are conveying information from the brain to the periphery and are efferent fibres. We want the afferent fibres. There are a few types of neurons involved with the transmission of signals from the brain to the periphery. The first one is the pseudo-unipolar neuron, which relays messages from the skin and the muscles to the spinal cord. They are the primary neurons responsible for coordinating movements after input from the brain. Bipolar neurons send and receive information from the world, such as in the eye, receiving and transmitting the light signal. Multipolar neurons are able to receive impulses from multiple neurons and transmit the signal through their axons. A sensory pathway is made up of a 3-neuron chain. The first-order neurons take the signal from their periphery to the CNS. Their cell bodies are located in the ganglia, but they do not synapse with anything here. Their second-order neurons are located within the CNS, and this is where the first-order neuron synapses. Their axons cross over at the midline and run to the thalamus. The third-order neuron is synapsed by the second-order neuron in the thalamus and transports the signal to the relevant region of the cerebral cortex. Because we have those segmental spinal nerves, we have predictable patterns in which these nerves carry signals from. These specific areas are called dermatomes. We have a dermatomal map that is regularly seen as a poster in the physician's office, and these maps help to determine the patterns of pain and explain how referred pain from one region of the body can present in other regions of the body. Dermatome maps are often coloured and labelled to identify the spinal segmental nerve that is innervating the skin at each region. Here we can see the cervical spinal nerves and the skin of these areas which is innervated by these, followed by the thoracic, the lumbar, and the sacral. Similarly, the face is also patterned, but these are not called dermatomes. The pattern of the facial skin is determined by the 3 branches of the trigeminal nerve, the ophthalmic, maxillary, and the mandibular nerve. Now, to remind you of the cortical locations, we have a lateral perspective of the brain on the left and a mid-sagittal view of the brain on the right. These highlighted areas are in the frontal lobe's prefrontal gyrus, and we know this is the primary motor cortex. The postcentral gyrus on the parietal lobe by yellow is the primary somatosensory cortex, and this is the one that we will be looking at today. On this slide, we will quickly recap the anatomy of the spinal cord. Let's look at the grey matter first. Here we have the dorsal grey horn, the lateral grey horn, which is only present between T1 and L2 and S2 and S4, and the ventral grey horn. So now, moving on to the white tracts, we have the dorsal white columns, the lateral white column, and the ventral white column. And lastly, we have the anterior white commissure, which will become very relevant soon. Here is a simplified sketch of that spinal cord transection. I'll remove the labels and add a couple of blue blobs. These blue blobs are called the Spinothalamic Tract, and they are located within the ventral column, white column of the spinal cord. Here is where we have the ascending fibres travelling up to the brain. The dorsal root ganglion is also visible on this image, and this is going to house the cell bodies of the sensory neurons of the first-order neurons. The first-order neuron is a thin, slow fibre that travels to the dorsal rami of the spinal nerve. The receptors of these fibres are located within the skin. As that fibre makes its way into the dorsal grey horn, it synapses with the second-order neuron. The axon from the second-order neuron then travels anteriorly and crosses over the midline as the anterior white commissure, and then it enters the spinothalamic tract. Now, it's important to know that potentially these first-order fibres may ascend 1 or 2 segmental spaces before synapsing, but the rest of the pathway will remain the same. Those second-order neuron fibres will cross at the anterior white commissure before ascending up to the brain. These second-order fibres are going to ascend in the spinothalamic tract and travel up to the thalamus. Now let's zoom out and have a look at what this looks like. The first-order neuron enters from the periphery to the dorsal root of the spinal nerve, where it reaches the dorsal grey horn and synapses with the second-order neuron. The second order neuron crosses at the anterior white commissure and the axon enters the spinothalamic tract. It then courses superiorly until it reaches the thalamus on the contralateral side. The second order neuron then synapses with the third order neuron when it completes this journey and synapses onto the cortex in the appropriate area. We also looked at the somatotropic map and the sensory homunculus that this was related to. This is located on the post-central gyrus of the parietal lobe. I'll draw in the thalamus for you. Those third order neurons are going to be relayed to the appropriate area of cortex. As we are looking at the spinothalamic tract, these neurons will travel to the superior medial aspect of the cortex that processes sensory information from the genitals all the way through to the neck, including the arms and fingers. So that was the spinothalamic tract, but what about the face and teeth? Well, the innervation of the face and teeth comes from the trigeminal nerve. The trigeminal nerve gives rise to 3 branches, but the ones that are innervating the teeth are the maxillary nerve, which gives rise to the posterior superior alveolar nerve, the infraorbital nerve, and the anterior superior alveolar nerve, whilst the mandibular nerve gives rise to the inferior alveolar nerve. Moving backwards, we need to have a look at the origins of these nerves. These nerves originate at the trigeminal ganglion, which comes from the pons region of the midbrain. The ganglion houses sensory bodies of the first order neuron in our 3-chain pathway. Here we can see the trigeminal ganglion a little more likely in situ. It has 3 branches, the ophthalmic, the maxillary, and the mandibular, that exit the cranium through the superior orbital fissure, the foramen rotundum, and the foramen ovale, respectively. They are all moving forwards from the face to innervate the teeth and the skin of the face. This is in a very similar pattern to that we saw of the dermatomes for the body. But where do these nerves begin? Well, they begin in the brainstem. And if we look at the image on the right, we can see that the nuclei for these trigeminal nerves run the length of the brainstem. The nuclei are another name for a region of the brain in which all of the nerves travelling to and from that nuclei fulfill a similar role. The motor nuclei are where the motor fibres for the mandibular branch begin, but we won't be giving this much more consideration for today. The sensory nuclei are the ones that we want, and these are seen in orange on the diagram. Now we have 3 sensory nuclei for the trigeminal nerve, and each nuclei has a different collection of sensory fibres according to their role, much like we had with the spinothalamic pathway and the dorsum column pathway for the body. The most superior for these is the mesencephalic nuclei, followed by the chief or principal nucleus, and finally the spinal nuclei of the trigeminal nerve. Don't be fooled though, there are far more many nuclei in the brainstem, but for the sake of simplicity I haven't included these on this image. So now we need to have a closer look at the nuclei. Each nucleus does a different role. The mesencephalic nucleus receives proprioception information from the muscles of mastication. That nucleus is particularly important for preventing us from biting our tongue when we talk, even if our tongue feels numb. This is because it knows whether our mouth is open or closed. The chief or principal nucleus is the one that receives more complex sensory information, such as vibration or fine touch and 2-point discrimination. The spinal nucleus of the trigeminal nerve is the one we want today, and this one transmits pain, crude touch, or temperature. It is divided into 2 parts. The pain is located more caudally, so lower in the medulla, and the crude touch is located higher up in the medulla. The first order neuron enters the trigeminal ganglion. In this case, this is from the mandibular branch, but it could be from any of the other 3 branches. The axons then run caudally in the spinal tract of the trigeminal. They then synapse with the second order neuron within the nucleus of the spinal nucleus of the trigeminal nerve. These axons then ascend and cross over at the midline into the Trigeminothalamic Tract and travel towards the thalamus. Once at the thalamus, the second order neurons synapse with the third order neurons, which then travel to the appropriate area of cortex. Because these have come from the Trigeminothalamic Tract, they have come from the face, so these third order neurons are travelling to the lateral aspects of the post-central gyrus. Now we need to have a look at the effect of a medulla lesion on the sensory perception from the body and the face. Here is a transection of the medulla, and let's draw in some of these regions which we have mentioned today. Here we can see the descending tract of the trigeminal nerve. We know that the spinal nucleus of cranial nerve 5 is quite long, as is the spinal tract of trigeminal nerve, because these nerves must be able to travel to the most caudal regions of that nucleus. We can also see that the spinothalamic tract is present. This is conveying sensory information from the body. Let's say, hypothetically, that we have a lesion here. We can see that there will be 2 potential sensory impairments. One sensory impairment from the face and one sensory impairment from the body. But will those sensory impairments be on the same side? No. We know that in the spinothalamic pathway, the crossing over of those second order neurons happens within the spinal cord, much lower than the medulla. So a lesion in the medulla will affect the contralateral side of the body's ability to feel crude touch and pain, as these fibres cross over the midline a long time before this region of the brain. So this is the spinothalamic tract that is carrying over fibres from the left-hand side of the body. In the trigeminothalamic tract, the fibres cross over at the spinal nucleus. So when we look at the location of this hypothetical lesion, we are compromising the first order neurons, or at the very beginning of the second order neurons before they have crossed over at the midline. So the lack of sensation will come from the ipsilateral, or same side of that lesion. So a lesion here will result in contralateral body sensation and ipsilateral face sensation. Interestingly, neurosurgeons have been able to explore these different tracts and pathways for the treatment of trigeminal neuralgia. Highly skilled surgeons are able to locate the spinal nucleus of the trigeminal nerve and cut the fibres on the same side of the pain. This means that pain signals from the trigeminal nerve on the same side as the surgery cannot synapse with the second order neurons and transmit pain. Because the other sensory nuclei are still intact, the tracts for proprioception and the discriminative touch are unaffected. And this enlightening piece of information brings us to the end of the discussion of toothache. So you should now be able to feel more confident in tackling the self-directed learning aspects of your program. You should be able to describe the general features of the pathways conveying pain and temperature information to conscious awareness. Explain what is meant by the term somatotropy. Indicate the functions and trace the route of the spinothalamic pathway. Outline the innervation of the teeth. Define the terms ganglion and cranial nerve nuclei. Describe the trigeminal ganglion and the trigeminal nuclei. Locates the spinal tract and the spinal nucleus of the trigeminal nerve, and locates the trigeminothalamic tract. Describe the pathway by which pain and temperature information from the head is conveyed to the cerebral cortex.